"Remove everything now," Mountain Man ordered his trembling fat bride. What he actually wanted, remove everything now. The words came out deep, cold, and final, and for a moment Maggie thought her new husband was a monster. Magnolia Maggie, Rose Sinclair, 24, stood shaking in the doorway of the cabin, her dress soaked through by mountain rain. The man she had been forced to marry, Jasper Wild, the rugged, scar-faced hunter who lived alone on Blue Ridge Mountain, stood before her, arms crossed, his blue eyes unreadable. Her father had sold her like cattle. No dowry, no ceremony, no love, just a signature to erase a gambling debt. When Jasper's command echoed through the small wooden cabin, "Remove everything now," Maggie froze, her throat tightening. Tears blurred her eyes. This is it, she thought. He's going to take what's his, what Father sold. But what Jasper did next left her speechless. He didn't touch her. He didn't move closer. He simply frowned and pointed at the drenched cloak clinging to her shoulders. "You're soaked to the bone," he said, his voice suddenly softer. "Take it off before you catch your death." Maggie blinked, confused. Jasper turned away, stoking the fire, his broad back to her. "There's a dry set of clothes by the stove. I'll be outside," he added, almost awkwardly, before stepping into the storm again. The door shut. The sound of rain returned, and Maggie realized for the first time that maybe this mountain man wasn't the beast she had imagined. But could a man who lived among wolves truly understand gentleness? And could a woman who'd known only humiliation ever learn to trust again? Tonight, on this cold mountain, two broken souls were about to find out. Maggie Rose Sinclair had learned early that her worth could be measured in pounds and shame. She grew up in the town of Willow Hollow, the daughter of a once respectable rancher whose fortune and dignity had been eaten away by whiskey and cards. While her mother's death had left an emptiness in their home, it was her father's bitterness that turned that emptiness into cruelty. "Too big to marry, too soft to work," he used to say, slamming his glass down. "At least now you'll finally be good for something." That something was the day he lost a poker hand to Jasper Wild. Jasper had been the talk of the town for years, the scarred ex-trapper who came down from the mountains twice a season to trade furs and buy supplies. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face carved by weather and solitude. People whispered about him, that he'd once been a soldier, that he'd killed a man with his bare hands, that no woman had ever survived a night in his cabin. When Jasper laid his cards down that night and Maggie's father realized he was ruined, the old man made a desperate offer. "I can't pay you back, but I have a daughter," he said, his words slurred with liquor. "She'll do." Maggie had screamed, begged, pleaded, but the preacher was brought before dawn, and by midday she wore a ring that didn't fit. Jasper didn't smile once during the ceremony. He only signed the papers, handed her father a folded note, paid in full, and said quietly, "Pack what you need. We leave by sundown." Now, 2 days later, Maggie stood in the center of his cabin, a place that smelled of pine, smoke, and leather. The walls were lined with tools, rifles, and bundles of animal hides. A fire burned in the stone hearth, throwing light across his scarred cheek. Jasper moved with quiet purpose, his presence filling the room even when he said nothing. He didn't leer, didn't touch her, didn't even glance her way unless he needed to. To Maggie, that silence was its own kind of danger. When he spoke again, his voice was low, steady. "You'll stay in the small room down the hall. It's warm, and there's a latch on the inside." She blinked. "A latch?" His eyes met hers. "So you can lock it. I don't want you afraid in my house." Her throat tightened. No one had ever said that to her before. "I don't want you afraid." But fear wasn't so easy to unlearn. That night, as she lay awake listening to the sound of the storm outside, Maggie wondered what kind of man Jasper truly was. Why would a solitary hunter take a wife he didn't want? Why pay a debt he'd already been owed? And if he wasn't the monster her father had painted him to be, then who was he really? Outside, through the crack in the window, she could see him sitting by the dying fire alone, head bowed, hands clasped as if in silent prayer. The Beast of Blue Ridge, they called him. But in that moment, he looked more like a man haunted by ghosts than a beast at all. The morning after the storm, Maggie woke to the smell of coffee and pine smoke. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. No shouting, no clinking whiskey glass, no heavy footsteps on the stairs, only quiet. When she stepped out of her room, Jasper was already by the hearth, slicing dried venison. He didn't look up. "Coffee's on the stove. Eat while it's hot," he said simply. Maggie hesitated, half expecting to catch the cruel remark, the sneer she'd grown used to from men. But Jasper only moved aside so she could sit by the fire. There were 2 bowls, 2 spoons, and a clean cup waiting for her. Everything was placed neatly, as if he'd thought about it beforehand. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. She tried to fill it anyway. "I can cook, if you'd like," she murmured. He glanced up, one eyebrow raised. "You can cook?" She nodded quickly. "I helped at the inn when I could. Bread, stew, sometimes pies, when there was flour to spare." For a heartbeat, his hard expression softened. "Good. Tomorrow you'll make supper. I'll bring meat." It wasn't approval exactly, but it wasn't dismissal either. That day, Jasper saddled one of his horses, a massive black gelding named Thorn, and motioned for her to follow. "If you're staying here, you'll need to know the mountain. Come on." Maggie obeyed, her boots sinking into the wet earth as she followed him through the misty forest. The trail wound through tall pines and narrow ridges, past streams that glittered like glass. Every so often, Jasper would pause and point something out, deer tracks, a fox burrow, a patch of edible berries. He wasn't unkind, just measured, like a man who'd spent so long alone he'd forgotten how to talk softly. At one point, she tripped over a root and stumbled. Jasper caught her by the wrist before she fell, his grip firm but careful. "Watch your footing," he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, "You okay?" Maggie nodded, heart racing. No man had ever asked her that before, not like it mattered. By the time they returned to the cabin, dusk had painted the world gold and blue. Maggie's legs ached, her hands were muddy, but for the first time in years, she felt alive. That night, she made stew with what Jasper brought back, rabbit, onion, and wild herbs. When she served it, she waited in nervous silence as he took the first spoonful. He ate slowly, then looked up. "Good," he said simply. Maggie smiled faintly. "Thank you." He didn't reply, but his gaze lingered on her longer than before. Over the next few days, a rhythm began to form, quiet, steady, strangely comforting. Jasper would leave at dawn to check traps, and Maggie would tend to the fire, clean the house, and prepare food. Sometimes he'd come back with pelts and stories about the mountain's dangers. Other times, he'd just sit by the fire, sharpening his knife while she read aloud from one of his old books. Each night, as the firelight flickered across his face, Maggie found herself wondering what pain lived behind those pale eyes. There was something in the way he stared into the flames, regret, maybe, or memory. One evening, as snow began to fall again, Jasper spoke without looking at her. "You can leave in spring if you want. The debt's gone. You don't owe me anything." Maggie's spoon froze midway to her mouth. "Why? Why would you let me go?" she asked quietly. He shrugged. "Because I didn't marry you to own you. I married you to give you a chance to live." His words struck her harder than any cruelty ever could. She didn't know whether to cry or thank him. That night, when she lay awake listening to the wind against the walls, Maggie realized something she couldn't admit out loud. She didn't want to leave, not yet. Not when the first warmth she'd ever known came from the hands of a man the world called a beast. Winter settled deep around Blue Ridge Mountain, wrapping Jasper's cabin in white silence. Days blurred into one another, the rhythm of snow, smoke, and quiet companionship. Maggie had never known stillness could feel so alive. Each morning, Jasper rose before dawn, lighting the fire and brewing coffee before she stirred. Sometimes she'd wake to find a small bundle of firewood already stacked by the door, or a note left on the table. "Don't go past the ridge. Wolves this week." At first, his watchfulness felt like control, another form of her father's tyranny. But over time, she began to recognize the difference. Jasper's rules didn't cage her. They protected her. She learned to keep the cabin running. The woodpile grew taller under her hands. The pantry stayed stocked with jars of dried herbs and beans she'd preserved herself. When Jasper returned from hunting, she would clean and tan the hides beside him, her small, careful movements contrasting with his broad, deliberate ones. "You got steady hands," he said one evening, watching her scrape a deer hide smooth. Maggie flushed. "My father said I was clumsy." Jasper grunted. Then he was wrong. It wasn't much, but it was the first compliment anyone had given her in years. As the days shortened and the snow deepened, their world shrank to the warm circle of light around the hearth. Sometimes Jasper would mend a trap while Maggie read aloud from one of his books. Other nights they'd sit in silence, the fire cracking softly between them, and it felt as though words would only cheapen what was already understood. Once she caught him watching her as she kneaded dough. His eyes softened not with lust, but with something quieter, respect, warmth, recognition. When their gazes met, he looked away quickly, the tips of his ears red from the fire's glow. One evening, as snow fell thick outside, Jasper noticed Maggie shivering. Without a word, he took the blanket off his own shoulders and draped it over hers. She froze, startled by the simple intimacy of it. "You don't have to do that," she whispered. "I know," he said, settling back into his chair. "But you're cold." Something inside her, something small and long buried, thawed just a little more. Days later, she decided to return the kindness. While Jasper was out checking traps, she baked her first loaf of bread since moving in. The smell filled the cabin with warmth. When he came back, snow on his coat and exhaustion in his eyes, she handed him a steaming slice. He stared at it for a moment, then smiled. The first real smile she'd ever seen from him. It changed his whole face, softening the scar that cut through his cheek, revealing the man beneath the myth. "You've been holding out on me," he said, taking a bite. "This might just keep me alive through winter. Maggie laughed an unguarded, genuine laugh that echoed in the rafters. The sound startled them both. After that, laughter came more easily. So did trust. He taught her how to load a rifle and how to track prints in the snow. She taught him how to sew torn sleeves and fix a stew that didn't taste like salt and smoke. Slowly, they became partners, two lonely souls carving a home out of the wilderness. And yet, there was always a distance. Jasper kept a wall invisible, but solid. When she asked about the scar on his face or why he lived alone, he'd simply say, "Some stories are better left in the woods." Still, Maggie could see the pain behind his silence. Sometimes at night, he'd wake with a start, sweat on his brow, his hand reaching for a knife that wasn't there. She pretended not to notice, but the next morning she'd brew his coffee stronger, adding honey instead of sugar, a quiet act of comfort. Winter was long and cruel, but it did something neither of them expected. It made them softer. By the time the first buds of spring appeared on the trees, Maggie no longer saw Jasper as her captor or her husband by debt. She saw him as the man who had taught her to breathe again, who had listened when no one else ever had. And one evening, as the snow melted and the mountain streams began to sing again, Jasper looked at her and said softly, "You belong here, Maggie." Her throat tightened. "Do you mean with you?" He hesitated, then nodded. "If you'll have me." For the first time in her life, Maggie didn't doubt her answer. "I already do." Spring came late to Blue Ridge, but when it arrived, it painted the mountains in gold and green. The snow melted into glittering streams, and the air carried the scent of pine and thawing earth. For the first time since her forced marriage, Maggie woke each morning with a sense of purpose instead of dread. She had planted herbs outside the cabin, hung curtains she'd sewn herself, and even painted the old rocking chair Jasper had built for her. Their small home, once a shelter of silence, now breathed warmth and life. But peace, she would soon learn, doesn't last long on the mountain. One morning, while Maggie was tending the small garden, she saw Jasper standing by the ridge, staring at something in the distance. His posture was rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. When she approached, he quickly turned away. "What's wrong?" she asked softly. "Nothing," he said too quickly. "Go back inside." She didn't. Her eyes followed the direction of his gaze and caught a flicker of movement riders on the trail far below. Within days, the news reached them. Someone from the valley had been asking questions about a man named Jasper Wild and a debt that was never paid. That night, Maggie found Jasper sitting by the fire, the letter in his hand crumpled and unreadable. "Tell me," she said, "whatever it is, I deserve to know." He didn't look up. "Before the mountain, I was part of something bad. Men who took more than they earned. I thought I could fix it, but I made it worse. A man died because of me." She felt her stomach twist. "You killed him?" "I didn't pull the trigger," Jasper said quietly. "But I might as well have. It was my fault. I left everything after that, the war, the trade, the towns, and I swore I'd never be part of another man's cruelty again." He finally looked at her, then his eyes raw, haunted. "That's why I paid your father's debt. I couldn't watch another person suffer for someone else's sin." Maggie sat in silence, the truth heavy between them. For the first time, she understood the weight he carried and why he'd built walls around his heart so high. "I don't care what you've done," she said finally. "You've given me more kindness than I've ever known. That's who you are now." But the past wasn't finished with them. 2 weeks later, Riders arrived at the cabin led by none other than her father. His clothes were fine, his boots polished, and his smirk as cruel as ever. Beside him was Sheriff Dugan, a man whose badge had been bought more times than it had been earned. "Well, well," her father sneered, "you've done well for yourself, daughter. A husband, a home. Maybe I was too hasty letting you go." Jasper stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "What do you want, Sinclair?" "To reclaim what's mine," the older man said, holding up a folded document. "This marriage was never legal. You took her without her full consent, and I've come to set things right with the law on my side." Maggie's heart hammered in her chest. "That's not true. I chose to stay with him." Sheriff Dugan grinned. "Funny, because that's not what your father's statement says." It was a trap carefully planned, legally worded, impossible to refute without witnesses. But Jasper didn't back down. He stepped between Maggie and the men, his voice low but steady. "You'll leave now. She's not a bargaining chip any more." Her father laughed. "You think you can scare me, mountain man? I'll burn this place down if I have to." "Then you'll burn with it," Jasper said, his tone like stone. The tension snapped like a bowstring. Sheriff Dugan's hand drifted toward his gun, but before he could draw, Maggie stepped forward, her voice shaking but strong. "This marriage is legal," she said. "The preacher in Willow Hollow signed the papers himself, and I've kept them." Her father froze. "You what?" Maggie pointed to a small box on the shelf. Inside were their marriage documents, the ones Jasper had never even looked at. "I took them the night of the wedding. I knew you'd try something like this." For the first time, Jasper smiled, faint but fierce. Her father's face turned red with rage, but there was nothing he could do. The law, crooked as it was, couldn't erase ink and signatures. When the men finally left, the cabin fell silent again. Jasper turned to her, voice rough. "You stood up to him." Maggie met his gaze. "Because you taught me how." He reached for her hand, then not in command, not in possession, but in gratitude. "I don't deserve you, Maggie." "Yes," she whispered, "you do." That night, for the first time, he let his guard fall completely. The peace that followed was brief, too brief. A week later, long before dawn, Maggie woke to the sound of hooves on the frozen earth. She rushed to the window, heart pounding. Lanterns flickered between the trees, drawing closer. Jasper was already at the door, rifle in hand, his expression calm but hard as iron. "Stay inside," he said. "No," she whispered, clutching his sleeve. "They've come back, haven't they?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Outside voices rose through the fog. Her father's voice carried first, slurred with drink and rage. "You think you can steal my daughter and my dignity, mountain scum? I'll take back both tonight." Behind him stood Sheriff Dugan and 3 hired men, guns glinting under the lantern light. Jasper stepped out onto the porch, his frame backlit by the glow from inside the cabin. He didn't raise his rifle, but he didn't lower it either. "You're trespassing," he said evenly. "This is my land, and she's my wife. Leave now, or I'll defend what's mine." Her father laughed, the sound cold and brittle. "You think anyone in town will believe a murderer over a man like me?" Jasper's eyes flashed. "Try me," the sheriff smirked. "He's bluffing, Sinclair. Go on, get her." The moment Dugan's hand twitched toward his gun, Jasper fired. The shot cracked like thunder, shattering the stillness. The bullet struck the ground inches from the sheriff's boot, spraying dirt across his coat. "Next one won't miss," Jasper said. For a tense moment, No one moved. Then Maggie's father lunged forward, shouting, "Grab her!" Before any of the men could obey, the cabin door burst open and Maggie stepped outside, holding the shotgun Jasper had built for hunting elk. Her hands trembled, but her aim didn't waver. "Enough!" she shouted, voice cutting through the chaos. "You've taken everything from me once. You won't take this." Her father's sneer faltered. "You wouldn't shoot your own blood?" Maggie's eyes filled with tears. "You're right," she said softly, "but I'll protect my family." The standoff stretched, the mountain wind howling between them. Finally, Dugan spat on the ground. "Not worth it," he muttered, turning his horse. One by one, the hired men followed. Her father stayed a moment longer, trembling with fury. "You'll regret this, girl." "No," Maggie said, "for once in my life I won't." When he finally rode away, the sound of his horse's hooves faded into the night, leaving only silence and the steady crackle of the fire inside. Jasper turned to Maggie, eyes wide with something between awe and love. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," she said, lowering the shotgun, "I did. Because I'm not the frightened girl you married. Not any more." He stepped closer, brushing a tear from her cheek with rough fingers. "You're the bravest woman I've ever known." Maggie managed a shaky smile. "And you're the only man who ever made me feel worth standing for." He pulled her into his arms then, the mountains rising quiet and eternal around them. For the first time, they both understood. Home wasn't a place, it was each other. Spring melted fully into summer, and the Blue Ridge came alive again, the rivers singing, the pines shimmering under the sunlight. The cabin that once echoed with silence now brimmed with warmth and laughter. Maggie moved easily through their home, her steps confident, her smile soft and certain. She no longer flinched at her reflection in the mirror. She no longer saw the woman her father had called useless. Instead, she saw strength, grace, and the quiet beauty of someone who had survived and rebuilt. Jasper had changed too. The lines of guilt and solitude that once marked his face had softened. He still spent long hours in the forest, hunting or tanning hides, but he always came home before sunset to her. Every evening he'd leave his boots at the door, wash his hands in the basin, and kiss her forehead like it was a promise renewed. Sometimes, when the fire crackled and the air outside hummed with crickets, he'd whisper, "You saved me, Maggie." And she would smile, resting her head on his shoulder. "No, we saved each other." Their life was simple, no riches, no grand house, no crowds, but it was theirs, and that was everything. On the night of their second anniversary, Jasper surprised her with a gift, a small leather-bound journal, its cover engraved with a single phrase, "Remove everything that hurts." Inside, he had written only one line, "Every scar we shed made room for something beautiful." Maggie's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. "Do you think it'll last, Jasper? Us? This peace?" He pulled her close, his voice a low murmur against her hair. "It'll last as long as love knows how to fight." Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, not in warning this time, but in blessing. Sometimes love doesn't begin with soft words or easy promises. It begins with pain, with fear, with the courage to stay when running would be easier. Maggie and Jasper's story reminds us that healing doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means building something stronger in spite of it. Every scar, every tear, every misunderstood word can still lead to something beautiful if we choose to stay kind. Wherever you're watching from in the world tonight, tell me, do you still believe in a love that protects more than it possesses? Because the next story is for you.